Nurse handed me a hospital gown and told me to change slowly. I remember staring at the paper fabric and thinking, my husband has been trying to reach my parents for 40 minutes. 40 minutes! And my sister was somewhere across town crying over a Fender vendor. That was March 14th. I know the exact date because I had circled it on my kitchen calendar 3 weeks earlier, my annual OB appointment, which I'd been putting off since October. I never made it to that appointment. Instead, I spent that afternoon on a gurney in the ER at St. Rhett. Clements, with a probable appendix rupture and a husband who kept stepping into the hallway to make phone calls I could half hear through the thin curtain. My name was listed as next of kin for my parents on every document they'd ever filed, and my parents' names were listed as my emergency contacts because I'd filled out that form 2 years ago before my husband and I got married, and I never thought to update it. That detail will matter later. I want you to understand it wasn't neglect. It was just paperwork. The kind of thing you mean to do and then don't, because life keeps moving and nothing bad ever happens, until it does. My husband Daniel is an accountant. He is the kind of man who calls ahead before stopping by somewhere, who keeps receipts organized in a shoebox by year, who remembered our first anniversary when I had completely forgotten because I was studying for my CPA exam. He is steady in a way that I didn't fully appreciate until the night he sat next to a hospital bed for 6 hours and never once made me feel like a burden. I'm a CPA now, by the way. I work for a mid-sized firm in Columbus. I mention that because it matters to how my family sees me, not as a person, but as a resource. I have a salary. I have a retirement account. I own a house. In my family, that makes me the one you call when things go sideways financially. It also apparently makes me the one whose medical emergencies are optional. My sister Renee is 31, 3 years younger than me. She lives 40 minutes from our parents, in a 2-bedroom apartment she shares with a boyfriend who works inconsistently, and she has been the favorite child since before I could have named what that word meant. I don't say that with bitterness at this point. I've done enough therapy to be past the bitterness. I say it as a fact. The way you describe the weather, it just is what it is. Our parents are retired. They live in the suburb where Renee and I grew up, about 25 minutes from the hospital where I was brought by ambulance. They have 2 cars, no health problems, and nothing on their calendar that day except a 6 p.m. dinner they make every Tuesday. I know all of this because Daniel told me afterward. He told me everything very carefully, the day after surgery, when I was awake and eating Jell-O and asking questions. He sat in the chair beside my bed, and he told me the whole thing from beginning to end, like he was giving a deposition. I think that's how he processes things, by laying out the sequence in order without editorializing. He let me draw my own conclusions. Here's the sequence. 3:47 p.m. I called Daniel from my car in the parking garage of my office building, telling him something felt wrong. I'd had a low-grade pain in my lower right side since the night before. I thought it was a pulled muscle. By Tuesday afternoon, it had shifted into something sharper, something that made me not want to move. 4:02 p.m. Daniel arrived at the parking garage. He took one look at me and said we were going to the ER. I argued for approximately 90 seconds, which he ignored. 4:28 p.m. We arrived at St. Clements. I was triaged quickly. They used words like elevated white count and localized guarding and moved with the kind of efficiency that tells you they not just being cautious. 4:55 p.m. A resident came in and said they needed to prep me for emergency surgery. She handed me a consent form. I signed it myself because I was awake and competent and an adult, which is how medical consent works in the state of Ohio. I want to be extremely clear about this. No one needed my parents' permission for anything. My parents were on my emergency contact list. That meant the hospital would notify them. It did not mean they had any medical authority. It did not mean anything depended on them showing up. What it meant was that Daniel called them as a courtesy, as family, because your wife is going into emergency surgery and you call her parents, because that's what decent people do. 5:03 p.m. Daniel called my mother's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. 5:09 p.m. He called my father's cell phone. My father picked up on the second ring. Daniel told me he explained the situation clearly. The ER, the appendix, the surgery, which hospital, which floor. He said my father's response was almost immediate. My father said, and I am quoting exactly as Daniel related to me, "This is really not a good time. Renee got in a car accident today, and she's in pretty bad shape emotionally." Daniel said he paused. Then he said, "Sir, she's going into surgery in the next hour." My father said, "Is she in any danger?" Daniel said, "They're treating it as urgent, yes." My father said, "Okay, we'll try to get there when things settle down here." That was the end of the call. When Daniel told me this part, he stopped and looked at me for a second, like he was checking whether I was okay. I wasn't, really, but I nodded and told him to keep going. Renee got in a car accident. I want to explain what that actually meant because the phrase sounds more serious than the reality. Renee had been driving to a nail salon that afternoon when she rear-ended someone at a red light. She was not injured. The other driver was not injured. No airbags deployed. The damage to her car was cosmetic, a cracked bumper and a bent license plate frame. The other driver's car had a scratch on the bumper that the responding officer noted in the report. The ticket Renee received was for inattentive driving, 310 which my parents would end up paying because Renee said she didn't have the money. My parents left the house immediately to go to Renee. They did not leave the house to come to me. 5:22 p.m. A nurse asked Daniel if he'd been able to reach family. He said yes, he'd spoken to my father. She asked if they were on their way. He said he wasn't sure. 5:44 p.m. They wheeled me into pre-op. Daniel walked beside the gurney until they stopped him at the double doors. He said I looked very calm. I remember I was not calm, but I had decided not to show it because there was nothing useful to do with the feeling at that moment. 5:45 p.m. Daniel went to the waiting room and sat down. He texted my mother, "She's in surgery now. St. Clement's, third floor waiting room if you're able to come." My mother read the text at 5:51 p.m. He could see the read receipt. She did not respond. 7:38 p.m. I came out of surgery. The appendix had not yet ruptured, which the surgeon said was lucky given how quickly it had been progressing. Recovery was expected to be straightforward, 2 to 3 days in the hospital, a couple weeks of taking it easy. Daniel was in the room when I woke up. He was the only one there. He held my hand and said everything went fine. I asked if my parents had come. He said no, not yet. I nodded and closed my eyes and didn't say anything for a while. My parents arrived at 9:15 p.m., nearly 4 hours after the initial phone call. More than an hour and a half after surgery ended. They came in together, my mother carrying a tote bag with a candle and a crossword puzzle book she'd apparently grabbed from home, like she was visiting someone who had a cold. My father stood near the door with his hands in his pockets and said, "Well, you made it through fine." I said yes. My mother said the crossword book was to help me pass the time. She set it on the table next to the Jell-O cup and then sat down and started telling me about Renee's afternoon. How upset Renee had been. How the other driver had been very aggressive about the scratch. How Renee had called her crying from the side of the road and they just hadn't been able to leave her like that. I watched Daniel from the corner of my eye during this conversation. He was sitting very still in the chair he had occupied for the past 4 hours, with his hands folded in his lap, looking at a spot on the floor slightly in front of his feet. I knew what that look meant. It meant he was choosing every word very carefully before he said it, which usually meant he was choosing to say nothing. My parents stayed for 40 minutes. My mother cried briefly when she was leaving, which I think was genuine, just delayed and misplaced. My father patted my foot through the blanket and said to get some rest. Then they left to go check on Renee. Daniel and I didn't talk much that night. He slept in the chair. I stared at the ceiling. I need to tell you about the money, because that's the part that makes the rest of it make sense. Or rather, makes it make a very particular kind of sense that is hard to sit with once you see it clearly. After my father retired 5 years ago and my mother the year after, their fixed income covered their mortgage and their utilities and groceries, but not much else. The things that fell outside that category: car repairs, medical copays, the occasional travel, Renee's rent when she was between jobs, Renee's credit card when she overspent, those came from me. Not always through a formal ask. Sometimes it was just understood. I would get a phone call, I would hear the problem, and then somehow I would be the one solving it. Over the 4 years leading up to that March, I had transferred or paid directly somewhere in the range of $31,000 to my family. Some of it was loans that were never discussed as loans after the fact. Most of it wasn't. I had stopped keeping close track somewhere around year 2, which I recognize was its own kind of choice. Daniel knew the number. He is an accountant. He kept track even when I didn't, not to hold it over me, but because he wanted to understand what we were working with. He brought it up once, gently, about 18 months before the hospital. He asked me what I thought the money was for, what I was hoping it would do for my relationship with my family. I didn't have a good answer. I said something about responsibility, about not wanting them to struggle. He nodded and didn't push. After the hospital, lying in that bed, staring at a water stain on the ceiling tile, I finally had the answer. The money was supposed to make me matter. I had been, for a very long time, paying for a seat at a table where the seat was never actually going to be mine. I didn't say anything about any of this for 2 months. I went home, I recovered, I went back to work. My parents called a few times to check in. Normal calls, brief. My mother sent a get well card that arrived 9 days after I was discharged. Renee texted once to say she hoped I was feeling better. I said thanks. I made a decision sometime in late May. It didn't feel dramatic from the inside. It felt like putting down something very heavy that I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten my arms were tired. I called my parents on a Thursday evening and told them I was going to stop sending money. Not as punishment, not as an ultimatum. I just wasn't going to do it anymore. I told them that what happened in March had made something clear to me that I'd been avoiding for a long time. I told them I loved them and I wished them well and I needed to take care of myself and my husband and our future. My mother cried. My father said I was being dramatic and that Renee had really needed them that day. I said I understood that was how they saw it. We got off the phone. The part I didn't tell them on that call was that I had already taken one other step. A few weeks earlier, I'd been asked to say a few words at a small retirement event for a senior partner at my firm. Nothing formal. A dinner, maybe 60 people, colleagues, and a few family members. The partner, a woman named Carol who'd mentored me for years, had specifically asked me to speak. I'd agreed before March. I was still going to do it. At the dinner, I stood up in front of those 60 people, coworkers, Carol's family, a few clients I recognized, and I gave a speech about Carol that was genuine and warm and about 4 minutes long. Then I paused. I said, I also want to say something personal tonight because this room is full of people who understand what it means to show up, to actually be there when it matters. I looked at my notes for a second, even though I wasn't reading from them, just to steady myself. In March, I had emergency surgery. My husband sat in that waiting room for hours alone. He was there when I went in and there when I woke up. Not everyone in my life made that same choice. And I'm done pretending that doesn't tell me something important. That was it. I moved on to the closing of the speech. I thanked Carol. People clapped. 2 people at that dinner knew exactly who I was talking about. My parents weren't there, but word got back to them, the way things do in families, through a cousin who had heard it from someone who knew someone. My mother called me 3 days later. She was furious. She said I had embarrassed them publicly, that I had no right to air personal matters at a work event, that I was trying to ruin her reputation. I let her finish. Then I said, Mom, I didn't use your name, I just said my husband showed up. That's all I said. She hung up. My father emailed me a paragraph about gratitude and respect and how much they'd done for me over the years. I read it twice and closed the tab. Renee texted to say I was being vindictive and cruel. I texted back, I'm sorry you feel that way. Then I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter and went to make dinner. Daniel was at the stove already. He was making pasta, the simple kind he makes when one of us has had a hard day. Just garlic and olive oil and parmesan. The thing we've made on hard days since our second month of dating. He heard me come in and glanced over his shoulder. How'd it go? He said. About how you'd expect, I said. He nodded and handed me a glass of water and turned back to the stove. We ate dinner at our small kitchen table and talked about his day, a client thing he was navigating, something funny that happened in a meeting. We did the dishes together. We watched half a documentary about deep-sea fish that neither of us had been planning to watch but couldn't stop watching once it started. At some point, I thought, this is what showing up looks like. Not the big gesture, not the arrival at the hospital when everything is already over. This? Garlic and olive oil and a glass of water and a man who just keeps being here? I updated my emergency contact information the following Monday. It took 4 minutes online. Daniel is now the first contact, the only contact for anything medical or emergency related. It has been 11 months since the surgery. My parents and I are in a place that I would describe as distant but not severed. We speak occasionally, briefly, without the financial thread that used to run through every interaction. It's a different kind of relationship, quieter. I'm still figuring out what I think about it. Renee and I don't really talk. That part doesn't keep me up at night. What does stay with me is something smaller. About a week after I got home from the hospital, when I was still moving carefully and sleeping a lot, Daniel came home from work with a bag from that Thai place we like. He hadn't told me he was getting it. He just showed up with it, set it on the coffee table, sat down next to me, and started unpacking the containers. I looked at him and said, kind of without meaning to, "Why are you so good at this?" He thought about it for a second. Then he said, "At what?" "At just being here." He shrugged and handed me the spring rolls. "It's not complicated," he said. "You were there, so I showed up." I've thought about that a lot since then. You were there, so I showed up. It sounds obvious, and I think for most of my life I assumed that's how it worked for everyone. That love meant presence, that family meant you came when it mattered. It took lying in a hospital bed, waiting, listening to the sound of the hallway, to understand that for some people, presence is conditional. And for some people, it just isn't. I am one of the lucky ones. I know that now. Not because my parents are who they are, but because Daniel is who he is, and because I finally stopped pouring everything I had into a place that was never going to hold it. That spring rolls container, by the way, had extra peanut sauce. He'd asked them to add it without being asked. He remembered I always want more peanut sauce. That's the whole story. I keep coming back to the peanut sauce. It sounds ridiculous, I know. I went through emergency surgery, 4 hours alone in a hospital, years of writing checks to people who couldn't bother to drive 25 minutes, and what stays with me is that Daniel asked for extra peanut sauce because he knew I'd want it. He didn't announce it. He didn't remind me of it later as evidence of his goodness. He just did it. The way he does everything, quietly, without keeping score. I think about cause and effect a lot now. Not in a mystical way, just in the plain observable way that actions accumulate into outcomes. I spent years making myself financially indispensable to my family, and I think somewhere underneath that, I believe the money was building something. Loyalty maybe, or safety. The idea that if I gave enough, I would matter enough. What I didn't see clearly until March was that the giving had actually taught everyone around me exactly the opposite lesson. That I would keep showing up regardless of what they did. That my presence in their lives had no real conditions. That I was, in the most honest terms, reliable in a way that required nothing from them in return. That's not a character flaw in them. It's a consequence I helped create. What I understand now is that integrity isn't just about being honest with other people. It's about being honest with yourself. About what you're doing and why. About whether the story you're telling yourself matches what's actually happening. I told myself I was being generous, I was. But I was also avoiding something harder, the acknowledgement that the relationship I wanted with my family was not the relationship I actually had. Seeing that clearly took more courage than any of the giving did. And then there's a question of what you do once you see it. That part is where a lot of people get stuck, myself included, for longer than I'd like to admit, because knowing something and acting on it are different muscles entirely. I knew for at least 2 years before the hospital that the dynamic wasn't right. I could have named it. I chose not to because naming it meant I'd have to do something about it, and doing something about it meant losing the version of my family I was still hoping existed somewhere underneath everything. What finally moved me wasn't anger, it was clarity. Lying in that hospital bed, I wasn't furious at my parents. I was just suddenly, finally, unable to pretend. The story I'd been telling myself ran out of room. And once it did, I found out something I hadn't expected: that I was capable of sitting with the truth and then standing up and doing what needed to be done. Not dramatically, not with a scene, just quietly, the way Daniel does things: a phone call, a speech, an updated emergency contact form. There's a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look like a confrontation or a breakdown. It looks like someone who finally stops giving their energy to a place that was never going to hold it and turns, instead, toward the people who already have been. Daniel was already at the stove. He'd been there the whole time. I just had to be willing to look.